My name is Andrew Small, and I'm a police officer in what has to be the single bizarrest, most otherworldly place on the face of the earth. A small town in the middle of nowhere called Junction Falls. Here are a few of our strangest cases. The annual mystery screenings at the Westbrook Drive-In. July 15th, 2006 was a fairly quiet night, right up until around 9:30. That was when all hell broke loose. We got calls from no fewer than 24 live-in homeowners who all claimed that they couldn't sleep because a film had begun to play at the old Westbrook Drive-In. Now, that immediately gave us pause because Westbrook's been closed down ever since the multiplex had been forced out of business in 1979. So any screenings there were obviously unauthorized. When we had arrived, an old, so bad it's good sci-fi horror B-movie from 1956 called It Came from Mars was indeed playing at full brightness and volume. But we never did find anybody at the lot who could have been responsible. In fact, the only thing there was a single, red, 1950s Crossley station wagon, also empty, sitting in space 21B. But we figured we'd find out who put that there and started the film later on. For now we needed to shut down the movie before all the locals started to riot in their bathrobes and their slippers. And now this is where things get really wild. We looked everywhere, in the operations booth, in the old dilapidated concession stands, in that old car, and in any nearby trees tall enough to have an obstructed line of sight to the screen. But no sound or projection equipment could be found anywhere within a mile radius of the lot. As far as we could tell, the film was playing completely on its own. Luckily the lot plunged back into its natural darkness, silent state the second the movie finished, and the van had vanished too. But that only left us frustrated and confused. After that at least, nothing else interesting happened at the Westbrook for a good while. The so-called mystery screening started to get buried under more pressing work. And as the months dragged on, we began to forget about it entirely. But then, at exactly 9:30 p.m., on July 15th, 2007, the screening began anew, and the same events more or less repeated themselves. Angry locals, an empty lot, that Crossley station wagon in space 21B, and an exhausted but ultimately fruitless search for the responsible individuals and offending equipment. We were pulling our hair out, and it didn't stop there either. The next July 15th, the same thing. And it happened again the next year, and the one after that, and the one after that, and it's happened every year since. July 15th, 9:30, It Came from Mars, the red Crossley, like clockwork. As of this posting, we still have no idea how the film is being shown, in the absence of projection and sound equipment. But we have discovered some other things about the film since the case began. It Came from Mars was financed entirely by a man named Bill Booth, who also wrote and directed and starred in the film as its protagonist, Jack Burnley, and who believed the film would launch his Hollywood career. However, production was plagued with setbacks almost from the beginning. Costs ballooned. The two actors and the chief editor quit halfway through, thus forcing an inexperienced Booth to edit the film himself, something that he had clearly no business doing, if the final result is any indication. And Booth bankrupted himself when he paid the rest of his family's savings to the Westbrook Drive-In Theater to hold the movie's premiere on July 15th, 1956. Sadly though, It Came from Mars received overwhelmingly negative reviews from the few critics who had attended their own screening, and Booth attended the official premiere alone, as the cast and crew were too embarrassed to be associated with it. Then, Booth's wife left him the following month due to their declining financial situation. Humiliated, penniless, and alone, Bill Booth drove his red 1950 Crossley station wagon to the Westbrook, parked once again in space 21B, and shot himself in the mouth. A forgotten off Hollywood tragedy. Now obviously, none of this explains the physics of how a film could play on its own, or how an old car can appear and vanish the way the Crossley does every July 15th. So officially, the case remains unsolved. But when the above details were first reported by the Junction Falls Dispatch in April of this year, the story of what many assumed to be that of an old filmmaker's ghost caused a sensation. And on July 15th, 349 people came and joined the red 1950 Chrysler station wagon in watching this stupid, tacky, low-budget, wonderful film. The case status remains unsolved. The Screamin House. Well, before I joined the JFPD in 2005, a large abandoned two-story house in the Shelby neighborhood had already carved out for itself a rather macabre reputation. You see, at random times during the night, you can hear shrill and desperate screams and cries for help, seemingly coming from a woman trapped inside. The department dispatched a unit to investigate. Bizarrely enough though, the officers were unable to locate the trapped woman because the screams themselves always seemed to be coming from a part of the house that nobody was in or near. When the screaming came from the master bedroom upstairs, the officers charged up the second story and entered the room, only to find it empty and that the screaming could now be heard coming from the kitchen. So they went to the kitchen, only to discover that the sounds were now coming from the cellar. And when they went to the cellar, they realized that they could hear it, once again, coming from the vicinity of the master bedroom. No matter where they were, the screams and cries were always coming from someplace else. Eventually, they called for backup, but even with each room covered by an officer, the team couldn't seem to find the source, isolate the screams, or even reach for a consensus as to where it was coming from. They never did find the woman, and each of the 6 men and 3 women who were there suffered at least moderate psychological damage as a result of their experience. As far as the hows and whys, the leading official theory, at least in regards to the bouncing sound phenomenon, is that there is a subtle trick of architecture that is wreaking havoc on the acoustics inside the structure. I'm not sure if anybody buys that, but at least they're trying. But no one can explain the source of the screams to begin with. No woman has ever been found inside, and would have never survived as long as the screams have now lasted anyway. Priests have given it the all clear as far as potential demonic activity, and the man who built and later sold the house assures us that he is as horrified as we are, and most certainly did not build the place with any abnormalities that could mess with the acoustics, let alone with hidden compartments that might have housed a captive woman. The official position of the JFPD? Don't go in or near that place. It still makes those sounds, and we're no closer to figuring it out than we were years ago. Status: unsolved. Mr. Mystery's traveling circus and extravaganza. Sometimes we'll have 2 cases that end up being connected down the road by a single cause and solution. This particular time, the 2 cases were: 1, a string of disappearances affecting the local homeless population, and 2, reports of, and I'm not kidding here, a clown that was allegedly attempting to lure people into the woods. I mean, for obvious reasons, we took the former case more seriously. But then, a few weeks into the investigations, a local business owner came by the precinct and delivered to us the previous night's security camera footage, which showed a drugged up homeless man being led off towards the woods by, you guessed it, a post-vaudeville jester with a ruffled collar and a skip in his step. Eventually we traced that particular vanishing to a small shack in the woods beyond the outskirts of town, and kicked in the door to find a scene of spectacular and breathtaking brutality. All 6 of the homeless men who had been reported missing, including the one from the footage, are not only dead but mutilated, burnt and twisted, hairless and diseased and disfigured. They had all been experimented on too. One man had all of his limbs amputated, and one of each could be found sewn to the backs and sides of 4 other men who had, like him, died of infections. The last man was intact and then some. He had been injected with various substances ranging from silicone to cement in order to produce warts and bumps and other unsightly abnormalities of the flesh. We had found the clown too, who ended up being an unstable lunatic named Terry Bird, who claimed he was working on behalf of somebody known as the Ringmaster. When pressed for further information, Terry claimed that he didn't know the Ringmaster's identity, but was familiar with his plans. Oddly enough, The ringmaster wanted to create and host a classic touring carnival called Mr. Mystery's Traveling Circus and Extravaganza. And of course, no good carnival would be complete without a genuine freak show. Terry alleged the ringmaster had enlisted his help in finding some willing and unwilling volunteers, as he put it. Terry got a life sentence without parole, and we kept our search for this ringmaster, but we never did find him. And about a year after our own homeless incident, the nearby towns of Doolittle and Crosby Springs reported that their homeless men were being abducted as well. We did what we could to help, even going so far as to offer Terry a plea deal for information on the ringmaster. But he simply laughed, and I punched him in the face and got a week's leave, and said that he quite liked to sell. It's cozy. As of this posting, any information on the ringmaster will yield a $10,000 reward. Status: partially solved. Perpetrator at large: Abigail Jones from Stanford Springs. About 10 or 12 miles southeast of Junction Falls, near the hiking trails, you'll find an old ghost town called Stanford Springs. Now, I'm no expert on it. I'm sure the local rangers and tour guides could fill you in, if you're interested. But from what I understand, it used to be a tiny little late 19th century community in its heyday that featured a small general store, a clinic, a church, and 12 or 13 houses. Inside the buildings, you'll still see all the original furniture, and some clothes in the closet, toys in the children's rooms, small animal bones in the barns and coops, and various other indications that the town was both lived in and abandoned in a hurry. The verdict is still out on what caused that. It's eerie and creepy and totally cool, and for obvious reasons, it's a popular spot for Halloween hikes and other I dare you type of excursions. But here's why I'm writing this. In 2009, a hiker reported hearing cries and whimpers coming from the backyard of one of the houses there. He had called it in, and rangers found and opened a previously undiscovered cellar beneath the house, in which a little girl had been staying for an indeterminate amount of time. She was dressed in an old gown and scared to death. After confirming that she was okay, the rangers asked her all of the basics: her name, how she had got there, where and who her parents were, and so on. The girl said that her name was Abigail, that her parents owned the house above and that they'd put her there and gone back inside to get the rest of the children. Upon further questioning, Abigail insists in 1884, and that her parents had only been gone for minutes, and not decades. And keep in mind, this girl is maybe 9 or 10. She's just bawling her eyes out, confused, and so terrified that she's shaking. So either she's a future Oscar nominee, putting on the performance of a lifetime for no reason whatsoever, or she really is convinced that she was a resident of this 19th century Stanford Springs. So they take her down to the Junction Falls Medical Center, and she's keeping up the act too, just in awe of people and technology, mouth agape. And they get her tested. No brain damage, no malnutrition, no other disorders of any kind. She's a perfectly healthy little 9-year-old kid, and she just insists that her parents were Thomas and Elizabeth Jones, 19th century shopkeepers. You can probably tell where this is going. The authorities searched exhaustively for any record of a missing girl matching Abigail's description, and they found nothing. No birth certificate, no medical records, no social security number, and no relatives. And of course, other folks who had caught wind of the situation through the dispatch report did some research on their own, and you guessed it. And there is indeed a Thomas Jones and Elizabeth Jones, shopkeepers who lived in Stanford Springs in 1884, and who had 3 children, including a daughter named Abigail. There's still no information on what had happened to the town. Eventually they put Abigail with a child placement agency, and I have no idea what came of her after that. But it's definitely one of the weirdest Junction Falls stories I've ever heard. Status: unsolved. Ranjit Singh, explorer of the sewers. Beyond and beneath the standard subsurface level, routinely accessed by maintenance crews, the Junction Falls sewers most closely resemble the catacombs of Paris, or Odessa than any functioning sewer system. It's just a labyrinth of tunnels that plunge deep into the earth, and stretch on for miles and miles and miles, twisting and turning and circling back around and getting hopelessly tangled. It is a far, far larger network than would even be remotely necessary to accommodate a town this size, and it makes no sense at all from an engineering perspective. In addition, nobody knows how big they are, how old they are, or ancient we presume at the deepest levels, what lies within them, who contributed to their construction or when and why, or how it's laid out. The department has been slowly piecing together a map, but even the most optimistic estimates put our progress at or near 25%. It's almost certainly closer to 12 or 15. So for obvious reasons, we dread when a missing person case involves the sewers. But luckily, between 2006 and 2014, we had Rahi Singh. Now Rahi was a Junction Falls legend, an experienced spelunker and outdoorsman who took it upon himself to explore the deep sewers in depth, uncover their secrets, and not only lend his knowledge and help to the force whenever asked, but to document his findings for both his, now removed blog and the Dispatch. Among the most insane things he had encountered and recorded are Pipetown. I've actually been to this one, but it's one of his more popular stories, so I'll add it here anyway. A makeshift tent city in a cavernous sewer chamber beneath the north side of projects that was built by and for the city's disproportionately large population of addicts, vagabonds, and at-large criminals. Pipetown had all the cozy trappings of a third world back alley slum. Tents and shacks, cardboard, aluminum sheets, drum barrel fires, human waste, illegal gambling and prostitution rings, arms trafficking, and so on. And so many drugs and related paraphernalia, hence the name. It's a lawless, unorganized, filthy, dystopian swamp. And it is one of the saddest things I've ever seen. A large portion of sewer-related disappearances either end in or in some way involve Pipetown or its residents. The Dogman. In a deep corner of the tunnels only ever accessed by Singe and his camera, Rahi ran across a naked man with the head of a pointer dog. Luckily, the Dogman is harmless from what we can tell. In the video Singe took, he was clearly aware of Rahit's presence, but didn't seem the least bit alarmed by it, and made no effort to interact with him at all. Singe claimed he'd seen the creature frequently down there, since and that it never did anything other than sleep, sit in a corner or stare at you, or prance around on all four human limbs. The JFPD's official advice is to try not to feed or interact with the Dogman in any way. Clearly it's getting along just fine without us, and has no intention of causing harm, so there's no need to upset the balance. The door. An old wooden door built into the side of the tunnel that you'll never find in the same place twice. Rahid is actually not the only person who's reported the door, nor is he the first, although he is the only one to have successfully recorded it. Since it can pop up in the more accessible near-surface tunnels, just as easily as it can appear in the dark depths of the sewers. As is the case with almost everything in the sewers though, no one knows who built the door, what its nature or purpose is, the extent of its abilities or properties, or how it vanishes and reappears the way that it does. The only thing that we do know about it, definitively, and other than the fact that it moves around, is that those who enter it tend to vanish without a trace. In 2013, Renee became the first person to find somebody who had been rumored to have disappeared through the door. Sadly, the poor girl had been dead for some time. He had found her corpse months and months after her disappearance case had been shelved, and in the part of the sewers nobody could have possibly predicted she'd end up in given where she'd entered. As far as we can tell from the photos, she had entered the door, and an indeterminate amount of time later, found herself in a forgotten tunnel where she starved to death, lost and alone. It's a horrible way to go. The clock room. Literally just a room full of clocks and other timekeeping devices. Cuckoo clocks, standard wall clocks, wristwatches, and digital alarm clocks. You'll even find some egg timers there, as well as hourglasses and a gorgeous grandfather clock in the back corner. Singed had recorded it all. The room is too far from the nearest sewer access point to be easily explained as where some above-ground clock enthusiast stashed his or her collection either. Still, I have no idea what to make of this one. The Stalker's Stash. This one we actually did have to respond to, and luckily, it was close enough to the surface that it didn't take a lot of time or effort to reach. But the reason that it was so easy to access is because the stash wasn't paranormal or alien, or otherworldly in any nature at all. It was just a small little closet-like room not far from Pipetown, filled and covered with pictures of an underage local girl named Emily Fisher, who was 12 at the time. Although some of the pictures there were when she was even younger than that. All of the photos were clearly taken from bushes, trees, cars, or other places where she wouldn't have spotted the photographer, and therefore were taken without her knowledge or consent. Some were of her in class, others were of her on the way to and from school. Others were of her on the bus, in her bedroom from across the street, across the restaurant, at the pool, at a friend's house, and countless others. There were several there of her in various states of undressing that I will not go into here or anywhere else, and others still where she was happy and in the company of loved ones at what appeared to be a big party or a family reunion. Those were some of the most disturbing, and not only because they were what appeared to be the most recent shots, but because if the photographer was not bold enough to take pictures of her when she was right next to her family and friends, he was probably bold enough to make a physical move against her in the very near future. So we called in our findings and got some units dispatched to the Fisher house to explain the situation and protect Emily. Meanwhile, my partner and I hid around the corner and waited until the photographer arrived. It turns out he was none other than a serial violent sex offender named Davis T.S. James, who we were not aware had been released on bail when he awaited trial on another charge, and who had come to Junction Falls to do his business. And needless to say, we arrested him on the spot. Easily one of the most nauseated and disturbing things I'd ever witnessed, and one of the main reasons the forced loves redeemed sin so much. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't stumbled across the stash when he did. Anyway, he has countless more stories if anybody is interested, but the point is, Rahit is our go-to guy for sewer-related cases, and he's never complained when we asked him for help. One day recently though, it became our turn to help him. His girlfriend came to us in hysterics. She said he'd gone into the sewers in search of something called the Presence 4 days ago, even though he said he'd only be gone for half the amount of time. Luckily, there were heat light to mark his path with glow sticks and flares, so we were able to track him down to a chamber about 2 or 3 miles down into the sewers. Now obviously, the sewer network was dark and suffocating, but this particular room was even more so. It was so dark and so suffocating, it can only be described as harboring a presence, just like he'd said. A faceless, invisible, silent entity that felt malicious in any ancient way. I felt like I was being watched by something that just wanted me to suffer. Even standing right next to my partners did almost nothing to combat the power this presence had over all of us to divide and isolate. And the further in we went in search of her heat, the stronger it got. Before long, I could barely see my partners, and after a while, I couldn't see them at all. The darkness was so thick in there that even a powerful source of direct light couldn't avoid being overwhelmed. And when one of us would shout for the others, it sounded distant and obstructed. The presence fully muffled the sound, and then it muted it, just like the light. And when it had me, isolated and alone, it began to communicate terrible things, without words or sounds or images. I entered into that place a blank slate, and suddenly, I knew things, awesome and terrible, the essence of infinity and nothingness, the spirit of death. I felt like a child, or an insect trying to make sense of a man. In a panic, I turned and I ran back the way that I came. I felt like it took hours or days. In fact, it was at that time I had no power or meaning in that place at all. Luckily, all the officers had made it out too, and every last one of us was in the same state. Terrified in an existential way, unable to explain that thing, that presence in any capacity whatsoever. All we know that, in its manifestation of some kind of evil stuck out of time. Sadly, we never did find Rahit. The official story is that he died while trying to navigate a particular treacherous part of the tunnels, which is true. But we didn't go into the detail beyond. We weren't able to extract the body. For good measure, we also did not disclose what part of the sewer we lost him in. in order to prevent anybody else from suffering the same fate. But the only thing I can't get out of my head when I'm lying awake at night is this time doesn't exist within the present. None, the past, the present, the future. It felt like it all got rolled into some kind of alien, a Morpheus bubble of the fourth dimension. Which means that, even to this day, all these years later, Rahim might still be alive, sitting up against that wall, basking and beholding the present, lost forever in the deep. Status solved? Anyway, that's all I've got time to write for now, but I've got a million others that I'll throw down here at some point soon. For now, feel free to check out the JFPD website and let us know if you find anything strange you need us to look into.